Welcome to our podcast. We are so excited to have you along for our journey. My name is Madison, and I'm the Executive Director of Peace Restored. I will be your host as we discuss mental health and faith in our podcast, Seeking Healing, Finding Hope, which is a production of Peace Restored, a 501c3 nonprofit located in Indiana and serving women everywhere. Today on our podcast, we will be discussing coping techniques and the value of journaling. This is our second part in this series. And I would encourage, if you haven't had time to go back and listen to part one, to go do that. You're going to hear a lot of great content that will be beneficial for today's conversation. But again, today for our podcast, we have Emily Key joining us, who is on staff with us currently as our marketing intern, and will be joining us as a counseling intern here in the summer. So welcome to our podcast, Emily.
Thank you. I'm excited to get into our topic today.
Yeah, I am too. I think it's going to be a really good bridge from our last conversation, talking about we kind of set that foreground for what is a coping mechanism, or what is coping. Because if we don't know what it means to cope, it's really hard to talk about how to cope.
Right.
And we talked about the unhealthy coping mechanism, unhealthy ways of coping. And so we went through a whole list of that. And so we just encourage you to go back and listen to this, because it's going to help really bridge these two conversations together. But today we're really going to take a leap forward and talk more about some of those healthy ways of coping, because we want to equip you, our listeners, on how to cope well. So let's go ahead and jump on in and talk about what is a healthy coping mechanisms, or what are some of the healthy coping mechanisms that we're going to talk about, our coping skills. Can you go ahead and talk about the first one?
Yeah, so our first one is called the grounding technique, which is a pretty popular technique that is used throughout counseling and therapy. Mm-hmm. And so it's usually used during times of panic or really intense emotion that's kind of taking you out of the reality that you're in. And so you're basically going to be using all of your senses to ground yourself back in your present time and what is around you. And so an example of this would be, say you're outside. I see green grass. I smell the scent of flowers. I hear birds chirping. I can feel the fabric of the shirt I'm wearing, or I could taste the gum that I'm chewing. And so you can really do it any amount of ways. You could say, I'm going to say 3 things that I see, 3 things that I can touch, so on and so forth. Or you could do one of each, and you can do it for as ever long as you need to kind of bring your brain out of that fight or flight or freeze that we were talking about in the first episode, and bringing you back into where you are.
Yeah, that's really good. Because to remind our listeners, if you didn't hear the first podcast, but if you maybe forgot, which some of us might have, because that happens,
right?
is the reason why we want to do this is when we are in the state of needing to use a coping mechanism, that emotional state of our brain has been triggered, right? Mm-hmm. So our frontal lobe is shut down. It's not working properly. It's not processing rational thought. Mm-hmm. So where we can be able to have those everyday thought processes. And so we're wanting to re-engage that. And the way we re-engage our frontal lobe is by doing some of the things you're talking about, is by using these coping mechanisms. When we think about, what does the table feel like? What does our shirt feel like? All those things, we're forcing our brain to go into logic.
Right.
Because you can't think about those things without using logic. Mm-hmm. If I was to reach over here and touch this brick wall behind me, I would have to use logic to go, what does that feel like? I'm not using my emotional center. I'm not going, it feels like, happy, right? We're going, it feels rough. It feels coarse. That's a logical it's a logical thought process. And so by doing that, it's forcing that frontal lobe to come on. It's calming down the emotional center, which is back here, which is why I'm touching the back of my head, which is where the amygdala is at. And that's calming that. It's causing that to calm down, which is the purpose of those coping mechanisms. So a lot of times, I love this one that you picked, touching the ground, listing off the things we see around us, right? When I do this in counseling, I call it 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Have you ever heard that before?
I don't think so.
And so it's very similar to what you're saying. It's basically using your 5 senses. So you can use the numbers in any order as you want, but I typically want to pick, like touching is an easy one to do with 5. So you pick 5 things you can touch.
Okay.
And the reason why you do 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, because it's keeping you kind of going down this, it's giving you something to focus on. Because a lot of times when you're in that emotional state of your brain. You can't think logically. So if you have like kind of a tool, I'm going to pick 5 things. And you can pick your hand, go, okay, I'm going to do 5. What's 5 things I can touch? And so sometimes you got to run around and find the 5 things. Like you might have to go touch a wall, touch the carpet, rub your shirt, run your fingers through your hair. And you want to not just do them, but you want to list them out loud too. And there's a purpose to that, because if you just do them, it is starting to trigger some of that brain to get going in that logical state. But when you actually say them out loud, it's actually triggering more of your brain to get into that logical part.
Right.
So when you go, oh, I feel my hair and it feels, I feel hairspray in it. It feels a little stiff. I can feel the tablecloth and I feel the ridges in it. And you just kind of go around and do those different things. You're starting to do that. Then you go down 4, and you can pick any of the senses that you want to pick. So we did touch. We could go see. See's another one, right? So we could look around the room. What are 4 things I see? And you start listing those 4 things. And then what are 3 things I can smell? And some things, obviously, you may not want to put 5 things to smell because you might not have 5 things you want to smell around you. So but you might you might have candles around. So go pick up a candle or something that has some type of aroma. Maybe you put some kind of scented shampoo in your hair. You could smell your shampoo in your hair. So just start thinking through those. Then 2 would be, or what are 2 things I can, what is, I'm trying to think of the 5 senses now. We did touching, we did
taste,
and hear. So what are 2 things I can hear? Thank you. And so you can listen. What can you hear in the room? And sometimes you might have to go walk someplace, because like where we're at, it's pretty quiet. We'd be like, what are 2 things we can hear? Well, I can hear me, I can hear you. So there we go. There's our 2. And then I usually almost always do 1 as taste, because again, I think if we did 5 as taste, we could take us back to what we talked about in episode 1, which is triggering some unhealthy coping mechanisms. We don't want to do that. So like, what's one thing you could taste? Maybe you put a piece of gum in your mouth. I taste the mint.
Right.
And again, it's listing those things because it's triggering that brain to kind of rethink. So, there's all things we can do with that. So there's so many grounding techniques we can do. Do you by chance know of any other grounding techniques that you can think of?
Yeah. Another example of a grounding technique could be when you're in your head and you're going down the rabbit holes, the what ifs, any of that. You can put your feet on the ground and tap them or stomp them or any way to get yourself to remember that I am physically present in the place that I'm at, and that I don't have to be all up in my head and, going down all the rabbit holes and spiraling down, and that I am present in this space.
That's good. Here. Yeah, that's really good, because it is really hard, right? Because sometimes when we're in that heightened emotional state, our brain kind of takes us away. We can feel like we're in a separate place. We might be having a memory or a flashback. And so just that action of tapping the ground goes, oh, I am here.
Right.
I'm in this current present reality. And it brings us back. So those are just 2.
Right.
Different types of ground techniques. There's many more out there that you can utilize. But these would be 2 that you could put into practice today.
Right.
And they're not hard. They're just remember to do them.
Right.
And so I might encourage you to if you're listening to this, just write them down. Like write down a piece of paper, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, tapping the floor.
Right.
You don't have to write the definitions, just write those 2 things down. Because again, when you're in that place of heightened need, heightened emotion, anxiety, your brain doesn't always think like, what should I do next? But if you have it written down on a piece of paper, you just know, when I feel this, I need to go look at this piece of paper. So maybe, or if you're younger than me, you might not use paper anymore. So maybe write on your phone. So, maybe it's make a note on your phone, but like, hey, I can just pull that up real quick. So you want as little steps as possible to remind yourself of what that coping mechanism is. Because if you have to like try to recall all the steps, it's going to be more challenging.
Right.
So give yourself kind of an easy access to the information.
Right.
Yeah, that's good. So the next thing that we kind of want to talk about is mindfulness. Can you elaborate on what mindfulness is and how do we use it? Because sometimes when we hear the word mindfulness, it might be a little scary for some.
Right.
like, what does that mean? Like, what are you trying to tell me to do? How do I do that?
Right.
So tell us a little bit about what mindfulness is, and then maybe how we use it.
Yeah. So when I think of mindfulness, the first thing that comes to my mind is kind of being in sync with yourself and being connected to your full whole self, and not just your physical or your emotional, but everything else that comes along with, being present and being human. And so it's basically taking a moment to yourself, and there's like apps you can use. You can also just be silent if you'd prefer to be silent. And you basically, I know some apps have like prompts that like someone will talk to you and like tell you what to think of. But if you just wanted to do it by yourself, being silent, I see it as basically checking in with yourself and saying, what do I need today? What am I feeling today? And kind of checking in and understanding just what you need and what you're feeling. That was really repetitive, but
that's okay. Yeah. So what I'm hearing is kind of that self-awareness, like, who am I? What do I need today? Is there something that I need to help myself through today? And really focusing on, I think also when we're thinking about mindfulness, is what thoughts am I allowing inside of my own head?
Right.
Because if you sit in that space of just being present and thinking through kind of that being still space, and you're allowing negative thoughts to ruminate,
right,
to kind of just float around up there, that's not what we want to do. When we're sitting in that mindful space, we want to make sure we're using that positive self-talk. We're using things that edify, build us up, encourage, are truthful, not are harmful.
Right.
Because that's going to be really helpful as we're sitting in that space. Because if you can sit and be still and think about those things that are true and right, that's going to really have a really big impact. When I think about that, I think about, when in Scripture it talks about how we're supposed to think about things that are good and noble, and if, we're supposed to have good and positive thoughts. And those are things that go back and forth in Scripture over and over again that tell us that we need to focus on what is good, what is positive, what's right, because that's what's going to fill us up. We're also told in Scripture that what we focus on, we become.
Right.
And that's so true. Like, if we focus on the negative, that begins to envelop us. If we focus on the positive, that also begins to envelop us.
Right.
And so we want to be really careful what thoughts we allow to have real estate in our own mind. If we think of our brains as having real estate,
right,
and then what are we giving? Because real estate's something that's valuable. So what are we giving ownership of that real estate to? What kind of thoughts?
And I think, too, mindfulness is a good way to start or end your day, or both. And I think it's a good way to kind of regulate every morning or every night, or even, whatever time works best for you in your schedule of, like, I'm here today, I can do the things I need to do, I'll get done what needs to be done, and I'm going to be okay. And kind of having those affirmations that you can tell yourself, along with being aware of what things you might need, or if you need rest, or if you need, to eat healthier today because yesterday you didn't. Like, things like that, I think is really helpful when you have mindfulness, and it really helps you have a better whole than just being part of yourself.
Yeah. As I'm listening to you talk about mindfulness, it's also reminding me, for those of our listeners who are people of faith, I think you can add into that we talk about a lot in the Christian world is having quiet time, spending time with the Lord in the morning. And so that can also be that centering time for you. If you're a person of faith, making sure that you add that to your mindfulness toolbox, if you will, and say, I'm going to make sure I'm intentional with this time. Spend some time being still, some time praying, some time meditating, because that's really what mindfulness is, part of that meditating time. Meditating on things that are good, meditating on Scripture, meditating on things that are positive, and just really integrating those two things are powerful. And so, again, if you're a person of faith, I'd encourage you to really think about, am I using this as part of my daily walk, as my daily integration of my own mental health. And because one of the things that we want to really have conversations about here at Peace Restored is how mental health and faith, they really do integrate.
Right.
They really do overlap. And we really think that when you integrate those two things they're a powerful force. And so being able to take those two and put them together can really drive your mental health to a stronger position. So as we're kind of talking about these, what are some other things that we can do that are helpful from the coping standpoint?
Yeah, another thing that might help you cope, and I think this is really important. I know we touched on it a little bit in the first episode, but being able to recognize when you're having anxiety or when you're having depression or whatever emotional response you might be having to a certain stimulus and being able to call it out. And there's different ways that you can do this. And I think it's kind of based on how your brain works, but you could do this by like writing it out. You can do self-talk with yourself, or my favorite is speaking it out loud of saying, I am having anxiety in this moment, and not being afraid to say it or to write it and to admit it, because it'll make it 100 times easier to be able to cope with it if you're able to recognize it and call it out for what it is and not pretend like it's not happening or it's not that big of a deal or you'll get over it. I think it's important to be able to say, I'm having this and I'm going to find ways of how to be okay with having it and to cope with it, as we've been talking about.
That's really good. I love that idea of calling it out, recognizing it, not being afraid to say, hey, I'm feeling anxious.
Right.
Because feeling anxious isn't wrong.
Right.
You know, we all have anxious thoughts. We just have to be the ones that lead our thoughts. Because, you know, if we don't, that's when we talk about that spiral and it just gets bigger and bigger. And we want to make sure that we're able to recognize it as quickly as we can. One of the things that I like to teach about with anxiety is often when we're first starting to process through anxiety or starting to recognize our own anxiety is we don't know how to recognize it at the onset. We recognize it when it's kind of full blown, when we're in that spiraling place. Right. And so the key is for us to start paying attention to our cues in our body. Our bodies will tell us when we're feeling anxious before we sometimes even recognize that anxiety within us. And so, for example, you might get a little bit of a stomach ache. You might get whole tension in your back. You maybe you get a headache. Maybe you just get a little bit of queasiness. Maybe you start shaking a little bit. Everybody has a different response. Everybody's not the same. So that's why I listed a bunch. For me, I know I hold my tension in my back. And so that's something else I'm really gifted at. I've held it for so long in my back. I have to practice not holding my tension there now. But I'll get so stiff back there on my backside that it'll be like a rock. When that starts happening, when I start recognizing that my body's getting more tense and more tense, that is a cue for me to go, there is something anxiety provoking around me. And I've now learned that means I need to stop and pay attention because my body's trying to tell me something I don't even realize it's there yet. Right. But if I can pay attention, because usually I notice it when it's like, I used to only notice it when it was really tense, but now I can notice when it's starting to get tense. And I'm like, there's something here. There's something happening. I may not even realize that there's something that's making me tense because a lot of times we don't even realize like there's tension in the room until it's so big and we're ready to blow a gasket, you know, we're like going to yell at somebody. We're going to react harshly. Until that happens, we're like, oh, I didn't even know that was there, but it was. Right.
I think that goes back to with the mindfulness too, with like being fully understanding of your body and being in tune with yourself. I have the same thing, but mine are my shoulders. Yeah. And so when I get really anxious and stressed, I get knots in my shoulder. And so, but I don't even realize that I'm like this all the time. So I think being able to like train yourself of, oh, why have my shoulders been up to my ears all day? Maybe I should figure that out and take a break and step back and take a breath is really powerful and can really help accelerate your ability to not be like completely unfunctioning when you do have times of anxiety or depression or anything like that.
Absolutely. It can be a really good cue for you to be able to go, oh, there's something I need to look at. And sometimes it's not just body cues, sometimes it's behavior cues too. Sometimes we will start to get maybe a little snarky or a little snippy with people, or we might start saying things we wouldn't normally say, or we'll behave in a way that's not our normative. And when those things start happening, we want to go, something's not right. There's something inside of me that's causing anxiety.
Right.
And so we want to kind of pull back and go, okay, what do I need to do for that good self-care? And we can get into the whole, there's more that we need to do with that. But today we're talking about coping mechanisms, so we're going to stay in that. And so from a coping standpoint, we want to pull back and start taking care of ourselves. I love that the next thing that we have on here is talking about validating our feelings, because it really kind of goes into well with what we're talking about, doesn't it?
Yeah. So with validating your feelings, it's basically just the minimum of saying, it's okay that I feel this way and that there are reasons that I do feel this way, and I'm not just being crazy or delusional, and that I'm allowed to feel these feelings that I'm feeling.
Yeah, that's good. Because we need to be able to acknowledge them, to validate them, that they're really here, to accept them. I think the accepting can be hard too. Like, I'm not having that thought. That's not me. We want to minimize. We want to dismiss them. But there's power in that, because when we can recognize that and validate them, then that's when it gives us the ability to work through them.
And kind of going off of what we talked a little bit about in the first episode about the waves and how intrusive thoughts can come in waves. It's kind of the same with feelings, that, feelings feel really big and they feel really overwhelming, and like it's the only thing you're thinking about, and it's world ending. And I think it's important to understand that they come and go just as any thought would come and go, and that your feelings are okay to have and it's okay to feel them. But at the same time, remembering that it ebbs and it flows is really powerful to being able to even start coping with your feelings, and that they don't control you and they aren't who you are. It's just what you're feeling in that moment.
Yeah. I think that's really important. Feelings don't define us, right? They're feelings.
Right.
Like, there's a lot of emotion that comes up because of things we've been through. And so recognizing that the feelings are just that, they're feelings. I like to say they're usually an indicator or something that we need to look deeper at.
Right.
Doesn't mean that they define us. They are who we are. It doesn't mean we have to sit there or stay there. But we need to recognize them and we have to acknowledge them. Ignoring them is not the answer.
Right. It
might be what we want to do, but it's not the solution.
Right. And you won't be able to run from them. They will eventually catch up to you. And it's better to kind of take a break and to take deep breaths and understand where they're coming from and why you might be feeling like that.
Yeah.
And kind of start dissecting and looking back and thinking, oh, well, that makes sense that I would feel that way because this or that happened to me. And I think that's kind of going into therapy or having a good friend to discuss these things with, so you can have someone else to bounce your ideas off of and to validate those feelings that you're having.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, is having those kind of those healthy distractions, as you're talking about, those things that we can do, having those friends or going to therapy, having places that we can go to where we can talk through these things. Because we are, here is clearly, we're not saying every thought you have means you need to go see a therapist.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, just because you have a thought doesn't mean you have a therapist.
Right.
But you may need to have a therapist or a counselor to talk to. But sometimes it's just having a good family or friend that you can talk to, somebody that you know is trustworthy, who is worthy of hearing your story or whatever it is that you're struggling through, someone who can hold a confidence. You know, obviously we don't want to go around talking to everybody, but we want to find that one good person, one or two good people that we can really talk to is really important. What are some other things that kind of can be some good things to help us from a healthy distraction standpoint?
Yeah, I think one really good one is exercise. I know a lot of people use really any form of exercise to, relieve stress, but I also think it's great for having these healthy distractions because there's scientific evidence that exercising helps get rid of maybe you know more about it, like the science behind exercising.
Yeah, like the stress hormones, right? So it releases positive endorphins in our brain when we walk and when we exercise, and it really helps us be able to sit in a healthy space. So that's what we want, is those healthy endorphins being released.
Right.
And the more we exercise, and it doesn't have to be like a full calisthenics or something, like we're not asking you to go out and like become a weightlifter
get a
or
six-pack.
No, you're not going to become a marathoner. Like it could just be going for a brisk walk.
Right.
It could be find something that you enjoy doing, which I guess is a good time for us to kind of plug our group that we're going to be doing over the summer. Like we're going to be doing a group. Like if you're here locally in the Indiana area and you want to put this into practice, watch our website. We're actually going to be doing an exercise group. It's going to be, we're going to be hosting it with the Avon Parks Department. And so it'll be a really good opportunity for you just to put some of this practically to action.
Right.
But even if you're not in the area, you can find a friend. I mean, like right now, the weather today is absolutely beautiful. It's a perfect day to go out and go for a walk.
Right.
If you're a runner, you go for a run. You could take your babies, if you have babies, and put them in a stroller and go for a walk, or take your dogs out. Whatever, it doesn't have to be anything deep or intense, right?
You don't have to be sweating a storm unless you want to. Then you go right ahead.
You can, right? But maybe there's a sport that you love. Maybe you like to play soccer or football or whatever it is you like. So find a group that just wants to have fun. It doesn't have to be a high intense intramural but just a group where we can get together and have some fun. And it's building that community, it's building relationships, but it's also allowing you to build those positive endorphins.
Right. And I think that goes along really well with the social groups and building in a support system for yourself where you have several different friends, different groups of friends. You have different things you're involved in of what you're interested in around the community. And that helps too if you are having a hard time. You have a group of people that when I go with them, I forget about the world and I can just go have fun playing whatever sport I like or knitting or scrapbooking or whatever it is. And so that's a really great thing to have too if you have these different groups around you where you can just kind of go there and be connected to them and disconnect from whatever thoughts you might have that weighs you down if you're by yourself, and it's kind of helps you be connected to those around you.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many ways we can do that, right? It's being active in your community. I was just thinking they could also volunteer.
Right.
So there's all kinds of things you can do because sometimes just getting engaged with other people, doing volunteer activities, doing those things, those are good and healthy ways because we're building connection. Right. And that's what we need. We are designed to be in relationship with one another. And so that's really good. I love how we've talked a lot about today about how can we cope well? What are some good and healthy coping skills that we can have? Because we want to be able to know what to do with them and how to do them. Right. And then, so I just think that hopefully, again, you've listened to the first podcast. If you haven't, I encourage you to go back and grab that one. But hopefully this has been some good information for you. So you've listened to today's podcast and how we can really take something that can feel really heavy and we can learn how to walk through that and how we can take some good and healthy tools and give us some practical application of how can I have good, healthy coping skills. So with that, hopefully you can come back and join us again for our next podcast where we're going to continue the conversation on coping because that's when we're going to get into the topic of journaling. Yep. Because journaling is one of those things that people hear and they kind of cringe, especially if you're not a writer. You might be like, I don't like journaling. But, and a thing I always hear is I don't know how to journal well. And I'm just going to leave this out there and say, what does that mean, right? What does it mean not to know how to journal well? And so we're going to kind of get into that next time is what is journaling? How do we journal? How do we use it as a positive coping skill? And we're going to talk about some different things next time. So again, thank you for joining me today on the podcast as we talked more about coping.
Thank you for having me again.
Yeah, it's been good. So again, thank you those for listening today. If you've missed any of our previous podcasts, please check them out. In the meantime, if you would like to learn more about us, go to our website, peacerestore.net. And don't forget to check out our show notes, where you will be able to find the links and additional contents and a few videos as well. We are working on our project of the Classes on Demand, which will be releasing soon. We're really excited about that. This will be an option for you to be able to learn more and dive deeper from the comfort of your home. Make sure to be watching out for the announcement of the release date. As we wrap up our discussion today, make sure to stay tuned, as we will continue to share with you your practical ways where you too can seek healing and find hope. Join us on our next podcast, where we will continue to discuss mental health and faith. So come back next time for transformation, growth, and power. This is Peace Restored.